Hello everybody. Today I'm going to present a study aiming to to unravel the effects of self-generation and predictability on sensory processing and memory encoding of sounds. All of our actions have sensory consequences like singing and walking, and these are usually called the self-generated stimuli. We're able to attribute these stimuli to ourselves as agents of these actions, even for stimuli that are not intentional. For example, for stimuli that result from actions that are not intentional. For example, the act of us walking. So the main focus of this study is the processing and the memory encoding of self-generated stimuli. Studies examining the processing of self-generated sounds have used the typical predictive contingent self-generation paradigm, where participants press a button that always generates a certain sound, or they are presented passively with external generated sounds. And these studies have shown suppression of sensory responses for the self-generated sounds, which is known as the self-generation effect. And this has been attributed to predictive processing. But sensory attenuation has been also observed even in non-predictive contexts, as for example when participants perform several button presses and only some of them result in the presentation of a sound. This points to a non-specific gating mechanism during movement unrelated to specific predictions that can give rise to a variety of effects, including larger pupil diameter, among others. And a candidate reticular mechanism for driving these unspecific effects during actions may be the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system, whose activity is reflected in the pupil diameter. So the self-generation effect may be a compound of effects related to predictive processing and unspecific neuromodulation. Self-generation may also have an impact on memory. Some studies, for example, have already reported better memory recall for predictable self-generated stimuli, for example, spoken words or played melodies, compared to passively generated ones. And this phenomenon has been coined production effect. Contrary to these production effect studies, there is another line of work under the predictive coding framework stating that memory depends on the prediction error associated with an item at encoding. So at encoding, the items that elicit larger prediction errors, they result in better memory performance. So the aims of the present study was to elucidate the neurophysiological mechanisms underlying the self-generation effects, but also to examine whether and how predictability and self-generation interactively modulate the sensory processing and memory encoding of sounds. We collected behavioral, pupillometry, and EEG data, but only part of this data is presented here. We employed a design with 2 sessions in 2 different days to manipulate predictability. In the encoding phase of the predictable session, participants were presented with a series of self-generated and external generated sounds that were predictable in the following aspects. First, there was a fixed mapping between the button that they had to press, the circle that was filled, and the sound category that was presented. Second, all presses generate a sound, so there was 100% contingency. And third, the timing of the sound was predictable, either 150 milliseconds or 750 milliseconds after the button press or the filling of the cue in the case of the external generated sounds. In contrast, in the encoding phase of the unpredictable session, sounds were unpredictable in all these aspects. Here's an example of the encoding phase of the predictable session. So when participants were presented with the word press, they had to press a button that had a fixed mapping with a visual cue and a sound category. Once they pressed, as you saw, the circle was filled and a sound was presented. When they were presented with the word listen, a circle was filled automatically, and a sound was presented, again depending on the fixed circle sound category. Here's again another example. This was the encoding. After the encoding phase, they were presented with a short retention phase and then The retrieval phase started where participants were presented with several sounds, and some of them were previously encoded as self-generated and some as externally generated. So then the question appeared, and they had to say whether the sound was old or new. Here's another example. And again, they had to press. This was basically the design. So in this analysis, we only present the data for the events presented 750 milliseconds after the button press or the color filling of the visual cue. As you can see here, we found better memory performance for sounds that were encoded as self-generated in both predictability sessions. We also obtained N1 attenuation for the self-generated versus external generated sounds, irrespective of predictability session. And we also observed a P2 attenuation for predictable versus unpredictable sounds. So to sum it up, we found memory advantage and N1 attenuation for self-generated sounds, irrespectively of their predictability. Our findings may point to coexisting specific and unspecific effects of moderax on auditory processing, but of course, future analysis will assess whether the sensory attenuation effect and the behavioral production effects are related. Thank you very much.